Thank you all so very much for inviting us here tonight to talk with you about active transportation in suburban communities. Really, really excited to be with you, talk to you about the benefits of walking and cycling, how that can be fostered in suburban communities, and sharing some tools and tips for getting around by foot and bike in Richmond Hill. As Miles mentioned, as you know, who's jabbering at you, as Miles mentioned, my name is David Simor. I'm the director of the Center for Active Transportation. I'm joined by my colleague, Keenan. Just wave. Keenan, yes, is our project coordinator at the Center for Active Transportation. And who are we? Who is TCAT? So TCAT, we started out back in 2006 as a grassroots collective, and then became a project of the Clean Air Partnership, which is an environmental charity, in 2008. And we really exist, our raison d'etre is to advance knowledge and evidence to advance knowledge and evidence to build support for safe and inclusive streets for walking and cycling. Why do we focus on active transportation? I mean, there's obviously a lot of reasons for that. The big one, obviously, as Mal talked about, climate change is obviously very important. We are a part of an environmental charity. We know that the average car in Canada releases about 4,600 kilograms of CO2 into the atmosphere every single year. We know that air pollution causes 300 deaths every year in the GTA alone. So obviously, climate change is a big reason why we focus on active transportation. Public health is another reason. We know that physical inactivity shortens your life by almost 3 years. There are good economic reasons to focus on active transportation. The average car costs a person in Canada about $11,500 a year to own and maintain and operate. And of course, on the flip side, we know that cycling has a lot of benefits and walking has a lot of benefits. They give you exercise. They obviously don't create greenhouse gas emissions or air pollution, and they are very, very affordable. But more than all that, beyond all of that, for us, we focus on it because it's about happiness and it's about joy. We know that people who are able to ride their bikes or walk for just 20 minutes a day tend to be happier, they tend to be more socially connected, and they tend to have much greater mental wellness than folks who don't. And certainly given how isolating the past couple of years have been, I think a little bit of additional social connection and mental wellness is something we could all really benefit and use. So for us at TCAT over the past 10 years, one of our primary areas of focus in supporting active transportation has been on the built environment and on the physical infrastructure of municipalities. We've done a lot of work on complete streets policies and guidelines. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those, complete streets are streets that are designed to be safe for everyone, for people who walk, for people who ride their bikes, for people who take transit, for people who drive, and for people of all ages and all abilities. It's a infrastructure-based approach to active transportation. But of course, we know the reality is that in the GTA, we live in a world of incomplete streets, particularly in our suburban communities, like the streets in this image here. It's just one example of many streets in the GTA that I could have chosen. These incomplete streets are dangerous, they're noisy, they're inhospitable, they're unhealthy, they're economically unsound, and they're environmentally unsustainable. So it's obviously imperative that we rebuild streets like this so that they are safe and welcoming for all, no matter their age, their ability, or how you choose to get around. Now, I recognize that's a lot easier said than done. And to be honest, we were really going to originally focus this presentation a lot on the infrastructure piece. But as we were putting it together, I kept coming back to questions, and particularly one key question that we've really been asking ourselves at TCAT a lot for several years now, which is how do we get people even thinking about cycling and interested in cycling in a world of incomplete streets like this one? And for myself, the answer to that goes back to me as a kid. This is a picture of me as a 4 or 5-year-old, where I grew up in a suburban neighborhood right at the border of Markham and North York. And for me, one of my favorite things as a tyke was riding my trike up and down the street that I grew up on and to my local park. And for me growing up, being able to do that was a really big deal because I have two older sisters, and while they're pretty nice people now, back then let's just say that they never let me forget that they were bigger than me, that they knew more than me, and that they were always going to be first. And for a shy, introverted kid like me, having the freedom and the safety to be able to ride my bike by myself on my sidewalk to my local street played a really big role in me developing a sense of self-confidence and self-reliance and independence. And I share this photo with you all, not just as an excuse to illustrate how adorable I was as a child, although clearly I was quite cute, but because it highlights a lot of the conditions I enjoyed as a child that enabled me to ride that bike. There were, of course, those infrastructure conditions, the environmental conditions. So I had a sidewalk to ride that bike on. There was a park I could ride that bike to. But there were also a host of social conditions as well. You know, my parents could afford to buy me that tricycle. If it broke, they could afford to have it fixed. I had the physical ability to ride that bike. There were bikes made for my physical ability. I didn't need to worry about being harassed or profiled in public because of my race or my gender. There were other kids on my street who rode bikes, so I had a community of people to ride bikes with. And so in preparing this presentation, it really led me to reflect on my own cycling journey and realize that I wouldn't have ever gotten on a bike in the first place without a whole bunch of social supports that were available to me. And I realized that what drew me to cycling, keeps me cycling today, are those social supports. The idea that for me, there are social norms of cycling as a legitimate form of transportation. And we recognize that those supports, those social norms, those social conditions don't currently exist to the same extent in most suburban communities. And so we sort of thought, instead of talking about, or just talking about the infrastructure piece of active transportation in suburban communities, we wanted to focus on those social pieces as well that often are under-discussed and under-talked about. Now, before diving into that, let's set the stage a little bit and contextualize this conversation. So we know that most cycling trips in the Greater Toronto Area currently happen in downtown Toronto, as we can see on this map. And that's probably not a huge surprise to folks. But what many folks might not know is that there are a lot of short trips being made across this entire region. We talk about short trips, we're talking about trips under 5 kilometers that easily could be cycled in about 20 minutes. Now, what's not widely known about this is that majority of these short trips in the city of Toronto, 1.5 million of them per day, are not in the downtown core, but are in the suburban communities of Etobicoke, Scarborough, and North York. And that's not just Toronto. When we look across the entire region, we see that there is cycling potential, that these trips, short trips, are found across the entire region. All of the regional municipalities produce very high volumes of short trips that could potentially be cycled, which I think is something that's a little bit counter to what we intuitively think, certainly to what I intuitively thought. I intuitively thought that there were more short trips in dense urban areas than there would be in suburban municipalities like Richmond Hill, but the data says otherwise. There are 14 million trips in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area every single day, and a full third of them, or 4.2 million of them, are short enough to be cycled. So there's that real untapped potential for active transportation. Now, recently we've seen enormous growth in cycling in the downtown core in Toronto. There, cycling's grown from 1% to 7% of all total trips over the past 20 years. And that data is actually from just before the pandemic. So I'm sure if we include the pandemic data, it would be even higher. But in suburban areas, cycling has stayed pretty close to the same, and Richmond Hill is no different. In Richmond Hill, less than 1% of all trips are done by bike, and only 4% are done by foot. And so much of the conversation around active transportation, again, tends to focus on these dense urban areas, which is a huge problem because most Canadians live in suburban environments. Most of the short trips take place in suburban areas. So there's this, again, real sort of gap, a real dearth of conversation around active transportation in suburban cities like Richmond Hill. And so if we're going to be serious about carbon reduction, then this is where we need to be talking about, because transportation is the second largest contributor to greenhouse gases in Canada. And Richmond Hill's recognized this. Richmond Hill's Community Energy and Emissions Plan has set the target of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And the plan talks about how that's not going to be possible if we don't shift people towards walking and cycling and transit. In Richmond Hill, for those living without access to a car, particularly in areas with infrequent transit service, cycling can fill that really important transportation gap. And in the Greater Toronto Area, people living in suburban neighborhoods face poorer health outcomes than those living in denser areas. They're more likely to have chronic diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And active transportation can be a real panacea for that. Research has shown that by commuting by bike, you lower your risk of dying from cancer, from heart disease, and many other causes by at least 40%. And I mentioned that physical activity can shorten your life by almost 3 years, which is nearly as much as smoking can. So there is, again, this great need in suburban communities for active transportation. And there's a lot of potential opportunity, potential benefit with that as well. Again, there's a decent chance that what I've said so far is not necessarily new to you, which then really begs the question, if we know all this, then why are we still building streets that look like this? What gives? And that really leads us to this kind of chicken and the egg scenario that we continually run into, and it might be very familiar with you in Richmond Hill. That scenario is that, in suburban communities, many people are hesitant to try cycling and try walking to getting around because the built environment, the infrastructure is so unsupportive. We have these wide, high-speed roads. There's a lack of active transportation infrastructure that makes getting places to by foot feel uninviting and unsafe. Yet at the same time, it's very difficult to persuade city staff and elected officials to build that infrastructure, particularly infrastructure that reallocates road space away from motor vehicles, when so few people are riding their bikes. That's the chicken and egg. No people ride because there isn't infrastructure, and there isn't the political will to build the infrastructure because no people are riding. And so for the past several years, we've been working to kind of break that chicken and the egg scenario by bypassing the infrastructure question and tackling more of those social barriers to cycling. The core of our approach is really to try and incubate suburban cycling in suburban neighborhoods through community bike hubs. And community bike hubs are welcoming spaces where people can learn more about cycling, meet other people who cycle, and go cycling together. And as the idea is that as more people bike and support for cycling grows, local champions start to emerge. They start to build networks, and they start to work together with city staff and decision makers to address those infrastructure and environmental pieces and gaps that we're missing. And for most of our locations, our community bike hubs are in really simple repurposed shipping containers, like the one in this image that we use for bike storage, that acts as the nucleus for our programming. We'll talk about what that programming looks like in a bit. But we've launched community bike hubs in 3 regions across the GTA. We started first in Peel region in 2014 and 2015, and our first initial small pilot project there has grown into a series of bike hubs in both the municipalities of Brampton and Mississauga. In Scarborough, we launched a hub in 2016, and again, there it was a team of many partners working together, including the University of Toronto, CultureLink, and Cycle Toronto, and those hubs are now run today by Access Alliance, a community partner. And then in York region, in Markham, we launched in 2019 a hub there, and we are still continuing to lead that program in partnership with the City of Markham, with the Immigrant Youth Center, York Region District School Board, and the Markham Public Library. We're also very excited that we'll be launching our newest hub in the town of Newmarket in the next couple of months. And so our approach for, again, sparking that cycling adoption community environment, suburban environments, rests on a 4-step model that was developed by Dr. Beth Savan and her research team at the University of Toronto, who worked very closely with us to develop this model. And in developing it, Dr. Savan took proven strategies for how to encourage and sustain positive behavioral change, and then adopted them and aligned them with cycling interventions that have had evidence of success. And so the result was this 4-step model for incubating suburban cycling. So the first step is all about finding the neighborhood. This involves a lot of mapping. It's obviously important to think strategically about the location of a suburban community bike hub and the partners involved. And this is just one of many maps we developed to try and zero in on the best neighborhood to start our work in Scarborough. And I share this map in particular because I think it certainly helped dispel a myth we had internally about Scarborough, and particularly about car ownership in Scarborough. We sort of assumed that most folks in Scarborough and most folks in suburban communities own cars and had driver's licenses. What we found is that not only do many houses in Scarborough not own a car, but that there's actually a smaller proportion of Scarborough residents with a driver's license as compared to residents of the downtown core. And that's something that's actually found to be quite often, certainly the idea that folks in every suburban community, everyone drives, everyone has a license, everyone has access to a car, is a very common misconception that doesn't hold out in most suburban communities. And so you can see here, we mapped out where the bike infrastructure in Scarborough was, where the transit hubs were, where the population density was, where the destination density was, where the bike shops were, what the terrain was like, where potential community partners were, and so on and so on. Suffice to say, we created a lot of maps. From there, we then move on to step 2. Once we've identified the neighborhood based on all those factors, it's about identifying the particular barriers to active transportation in those neighborhoods. And so we conducted travel surveys and found that there was a lot of barriers to cycling in these suburban communities, some of which we already knew, but some of which we didn't. And so some of those barriers were, access to a bike, not knowing how to ride that bike, not knowing where to ride that bike, and again, not having anyone to ride with. And we found particularly that sense of community was a really big barrier for folks. Once the barriers have been identified, of course, then it's time to start addressing those barriers. And we do this through a variety of free programs. So we partner with local libraries to provide free bike loans through the library lending system. We sort of do pop-up community booths where we provide folks with with free repair, but also teach folks to do the repair themselves. We conducted workshops, both virtual and in person, on a variety of topics like riding routes in your local communities and tips for riding in winter. We sort of partner with local immigration services to connect newcomer youth to bikes, and again, provide those do-it-yourself repair skills that newcomer youth are then able to fix up a bike and take it home and keep for themselves. We've also been partnering with solid waste departments, including about to launch a partnership with the York Region Solid Waste Department to save bikes from landfill and use them sort of for parts and for refurbishing. Then from there, we're on to sort of the last step, which can be a bit of the trickiest, because we know it's not enough to get people to just try cycling once, or even just try it for a year. We want people to take up cycling for life. And again, it doesn't have to be for every trip, it doesn't have to be for every purpose, but we want people to consider it as a legitimate transportation option that they can use for most things. And so programs for sort of the flat step are really targeting folks who regularly cycle, but work with them to address ongoing barriers while continuing to build that sense of community amongst folks who cycle. But again, that idea is the more people bike, the more cycling grows, the more those champions and networks of champions come together to build support, to accelerate and get that grid of bike lanes and get that infrastructure piece. So that's the nutshell. So that's our 4-step model in a nutshell. And there's a lot more detail in sort of a guide we created, which as soon as we're done presenting, I'll put the link to the guide in the chat if folks are interested to see some of those details. Just to give you a sense of some of the impacts of this. So these hubs have connected with a lot of folks over the past 8 years or so. The hubs have repaired more than 10,000 bikes, have led more than 5,000 folks on route rides, have trained more than 3,000 people in cycling skills, have conducted more than 200 workshops and webinars over the years. And we know that sort of beyond these numbers, building the social infrastructure of cycling can have a huge impact on people's lives. And so I'll just share with you very quickly 3 stories of how these hubs are supporting folks before I hand it off to Keenan. So the first story, this is Alfred. And Alfred bought a bike 50 years ago. And for the past 30 years, it had been sitting in his garage. He hadn't really ridden it at all. Recently, though, a doctor told him that he should get more exercise, and so he got on his bike. And he got his bike out of the garage. He brought it to Markham Cycles, where Keenan helped him fix it up. And for the first time in 3 decades, Alfred actually started using his bike. He had that nudge of, well, I need some help with repairing it. He's now started riding regularly for his health, and both he and his doctor are much happier for it. This is Rajani. In 2019, she came to our bike hub to borrow a bike and start joining our community rides. And she found that, again, having those people around to bike with really helped inspire her to set a goal for herself, to find ways to use her bike as a way to get around at least once a week. And again, it didn't have to be every day, it didn't have to be for every trip, but for herself, her goal was to do it at least once a week. And so she started riding her bike, challenging herself to ride a bike to coffee, to meet friends, to do errands, or to just go for fitness. And riding a bike again after so many years has really helped for her rediscover another way to stay active without going to the gym. And she started encouraging other folks and challenging them to start riding once a week as well. The last story, this is James and Linda. So James had a bike that he was using. He came to us, to our hub, to fix up an old bike that was sitting in the garage so that Linda, his wife, could go ride as well. They attended a few workshops put on by Markham Cycles, and then they started riding together every day. And when their daughter and son-in-law and grandson visited from Australia, they brought them to our hub and they borrowed bikes from us so that the entire family could ride around Markham together. And the daughter's family loved it so much that they then started riding to work every day when they got back home to Australia. And I sort of share these stories with you because, you know, when we talk about big picture questions, the kind of things that are in that transportation master plan that Miles talked about shifting transportation habits and reducing our carbon footprints. Certainly I find it really easy to feel overwhelmed and to feel helpless a little bit, just because of the scope and the complexity of these problems, these conversations. And certainly what I take away from these stories is that for a lot of people, even in suburban communities that were planned with cars in mind, where the infrastructure isn't there yet in a lot of cases, it doesn't take much to change people's behaviors. That we can't let ourselves be mystified by the complexity of redesigning 8-lane roadways, that we can do a lot with a really simple social and cultural interventions to support people in taking that first step. And once people have taken that first step, we often find every step after the first one is much easier. The first step is often the hardest step. So I'm going to stop yabbering now, and I'm going to hand it off to Keenan, who will sort of tell you about some of his observations on the ground running these bike hubs and share some tips from you to help you maybe help take that first step yourself. So I will stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it over to Keenan.
Hello, let me share my screen. So just to reiterate who I am Keenan Mosdell, coordinator of TCAT's bike hub project in Markham called Markham Cycles. I've been with Markham Cycles since the inception of 2019, and I've witnessed firsthand how this social change we're trying to push in Markham can help people start riding despite like infrastructure issues and needs to help people bike more, to get more active and things like that. So back to what David was talking about, addressing local barriers to cycling in Markham. It is very car-centric, as what I think Richmond Hill is as car-centric as well. So people don't know where to ride. They don't want to ride with cars on the road, while sidewalk cycling isn't as safe and isn't encouraged in Markham and the suburbs. A lot of people do ride on the sidewalk, and that's not where they're supposed to be. So in Markham, we do have infrastructure issues we're trying to address without having to change the roadways. You can see in this photo here, we're showing people how to ride safely in a group, so they can learn how to deal with traffic on the roadway. Another social issue is, what about cycling in the rain or the winter? So with those group rides, you could find different routes and trails along from A to B that you can use instead of, I guess, the roadway or unfavorable places to ride. In Markham, there's also a lack of centralized cycling community. We do have those very road racing cycling clubs here in Markham, but some people are new to cycling. They don't want to those groups intimidate them and they don't want to join them. Then there's a broader lack of cycling representation among radicalized communities. Next is we're trying to build institutional capacity among local agencies and individuals to support cycling. For work in Markham, we are partnered with an immigrant youth center, as you see in this picture. Just along with us trying to engage the public to start cycling, get more comfortable with cycling, we are trying to broaden our scope, help local agencies build up that cycling culture within themselves as well, and work on establishing relationships just to broaden our scope. We also partner with other community-oriented organizations and government entities such as the school board. So we introduce cycling within the school, cycling education, cycling workshop, just like how to handle your bike, how to wear a helmet, how to get that first step from a young age, how to cycle to and from school, just as David was talking about when he was a child. What we also do is we help engage the local municipalities with their goals of active transportations and reducing greenhouse gases. In Markham, we partnered with the city of Markham with their active transportation master plan, helping broaden the city scope with different consultations and comments we can get from the public about cycling in Markham. Also support related benefits such as community building, like trying to create that cycling culture, as I said before, physical activity and providing an affordable transportation for residents of Markham. So our take-home activity today, I'm going to teach you about one of our steps to encourage people to start cycling. A lot of people have a bike in the garage that's been there for 20 years, or it's been there all winter and it may not be in working conditions. Especially in the suburb, access to bike shops may be limited. You may be too far from a bike shop, and you may depend on your bike for transportation, so you can't get your repairs needed from the bike shop. They may be cost prohibitive. Bike shop tune-up costs like $60, $70, and you may not have that cash to get your bike repaired. And let's demonstrate. We're going to demonstrate to you how to perform a basic bike maintenance and a pre-ride safety check. I will do this by doing a voiceover on a video I recorded of myself tuning up this bike. Do you see the video here? Yes, mouse, thumbs up. So first off, maybe you have maybe you've been riding all winter and you want to make sure your bike is all good for spring and summer riding. You just got to clean that bike up. Maybe it's been sitting in the garage for a few years. What I like to do is take a hose to the bike, just get the whole bike saturated. The wheels, you see the gears here. In this demonstration, I am cleaning a clean bike, so it's not the best example, but you get the idea. What I like to use is dish soap water. You don't have to use anything special. You can get bike wash, bike cleaner, but I myself use a low-cost solution of dish soap water. Hot water is ideal, so you just scrub around your whole bike, make sure it gets all suds, make sure you get to the dirty location, your wheels, get a hard bristle brush, clean those gears in the back there. The most common issue we see at our bike hubs is your gears aren't working correctly. That's mostly because there's too much gunk and dirt in the gears, not letting the chain shift correctly. So make sure you get every nook and cranny here in your gear mechanism in the back as well. Make sure all the gunk off. There shouldn't be anything on the chain, on the gears, on the wheels there. Make sure you get the front chains and gears as well. What I like to personally use to clean the chain, this is chain cleaning fluid. It's also called degreaser. So this is special solvent to clean the chain. It eats all the grease off. What I use at home is a chain cleaning tool, as you can see here, once I open it in the video. Through these series of brushes, it can clean the chain inside and out. So we're gonna put the chain in between these brushes here. Close that up. Then we could put some of those chain cleaning fluid in there, as it has a reservoir for it. The chain is the most important part of the bicycles because it's like a transmission of your bike. You translate your power, your pedal power, into the movement of your back wheel to move you forward. So once we put the fluid and attach the chain cleaner there, like the pedal backwards, you could see inside, you can see the chain. It's getting yellowed from the fluid inside the reservoir here. These brushes are rotating, working hard, cleaning that chain inside and out. You can see the suds on the chain as well. Once that is done, take the chain cleaner off. And if you don't have a chain cleaner at home, you can just use a series of brushes. You put two brushes and the chain in between those two brushes and brush those chains off. After that, just clean off your cleaning liquid. Make sure all the degreaser is off. Once that is done, we can inspect the rest of the bike. You can see here, there's no residue falling off on my hands. There's no black gunk or oily oil coming off on my hand. All those gears are clean here, the wheels in the back, these are called jockey wheels. Nothing stuck in between the gears in the back or the front. Now that is done, we're going to do a basic inspection of the most crucial parts on the bike. An acronym I like to use is ABC. So I'm going to teach you the ABCs of bike mechanics. Firstly, you're going to check the tire. A stands for air, so we're checking the air pressure inside the tire. We do that using a pump with a gauge on it. You can see our pump here, it has a gauge with writing on it and a needle. I'm going to attach the pump. This one's a Presta valve, the smaller of the two bike valves. Make sure that tiny knob is loosened before attaching the pump. You can see the currents. Whoops, press stop one second. Technical difficulties. There we go. Inspect the tire. Put the pump on. So once we put the pump on, you can see the current air pressure on the gauge. Written here, it's around between 40 and 0, so it's around 20. The unit of measure is PSI And written on the side of the, engraved on the side of the tire is the recommended pressure for your bike tire. So you can see here, sort of see here, it says inflate to 70 PSI. Some tires have a range written on it, 40 to 60 PSI, but this one has a maximum pressure of 70 PSI. So right now we know we only have 20 PSI in our tire. We're going to start pumping until it reaches the recommended pressure value. So once the needle reaches 70, we know we're all good to go. We don't want to pump too much air. You don't want your tire to explode. And if you don't have a pump with a gauge on it, a good way to go by is your tire should feel as hard as your forehead, but not as soft as your cheek. So once pressure has been pumped, just take the pump off, close the valve. Do the rear tire as well. And that's A for air. Next, ABC, which B stands for brakes. So you can see the brakes here on our handlebar. We're gonna test the brakes by pushing the bike or turning the wheel, make sure the brakes are all good. In the front as well, but I do see an issue here. I'm pulling on all the brakes and it's not stopping the wheel. It seems to be too loose. That's one of the most common problems. We'll show you how to fix it in this video. So how a handlebar brake works is that it pulls on a cable in this housing, and that cable is anchored to a nut right there. So what we have to do is to increase the tension on the brake cable. We're going to loosen this nut. We're going to pull a bit of cable through. You can also use a hex tool. Once that is loose, you don't have to loosen it all the way. Just pull a bit of cable through, increasing the tension on the cable there. And just tighten that nut back up. Now we're going to test the brakes again. It's working perfectly fine. Your brake lever here isn't touching the handlebar. That's how you tighten your brakes. Another common issue you may take a look is one side of the brake pads, brake arms are touching the wheel, making you ride slower, too much resistance. You can see here only one side of these brakes are moving. You don't want this added resistance when you're out riding. So how we fix this is there's two screws here, see right here, that fits a Phillips screwdriver. How these brake arms work is this spring tension on both sides pulling it out. Since the left side is currently rubbing, we want to increase spring tension on this side so that both sides are centered. So I'm going to tighten this screw to increase the tension. That will pull the whole mechanism left. May have to release tension on the other side. So I'm going to unscrew, 1 or 2 revolutions there. We test our brakes once again. You can see both sides are moving equally. One side isn't touching the wheel here, slowing you down. There's space in between the brake pads. So what I just showed you here is one of the most common braking systems we see on bikes. These are called V brakes. There's other types of brakes called cantilever brakes here. You can see it operates the same way with the cable here attached to this anchor points, and it just clamps both together, both brake pads together to the wheel slowing down. On newer, more modern bikes, we have disc brakes. You can see there's a disc on the hub of your wheel, and the brake pads are in these calipers here. And that's how, and the brake pads compress onto the rotor, slowing you down. We're not going to cover the other braking systems in this video. We're going to go on to ABC. We did A for air, B for brakes, and C is chain. Most important part of your bike. So we're going to just inspect the chain here. We're not going to teach you how to inspect your gear shifting over this presentation. So just make sure there's no excessive rust on your chain. There's no missing broken links. None of these links are bent. And what you should also periodically do after you cleaning your chain is to lubricate your chain. What we recommend you to do is to just dry your chain off after a wet ride, after cleaning your chain. Make sure there's no grime and dirt on your chain, no oily substance or grease. What we recommend you using is chain lube here. Bicycle specific chain lube. Some people put WD-40 on your chain, but that's not recommended since it's not actually a lubricant. As you can see here, I'm dripping a small stream of chain lubricant onto the chain. We don't want to saturate your chain so it's dripping wet, just a light coating of your chain so your whole chain is saturated. Once we have done that, we'll just run the pedals. You can ride it around the block, making sure all those the chain lubricant goes inside the chain. Chain lube is useful only inside the chain and not outside. After we've done this, we recommend you to wipe off the excess lubricant on the chain. So we just run a cloth through the chain here so that no dirt and grime will get attracted to your chain, making it dirty. So that's how we do a basic bike maintenance. You can see here only a small film of oil is coming off and it's not black and dirty. So we have covered the most basic parts of the bike. You can try doing this at home. I'll also teach you how to do a pre-ride safety check. It's also called an ABC check. So before you ride, just do this real quick to make sure your bike is in good working condition. So A for air, we're going to press down the tires to see if it's holding air. B, we're going to test out the brakes by pushing the bike and grabbing a handful of brake. Make sure you test both brakes, make sure they skid. See, the wheels are at work. Wheels are braking and skidding. C is chain. We just inspect the chain for any excessive rust or broken links. And that's how you do a ABC pre-ride safety check. We do have a couple minutes for questions. Miles, you want to take it?
Sure, thanks so much. I'm just trying to find my unmute button. That's really great. There's a lot of great information in there. We do have maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Should anyone have questions? And I mentioned at the beginning, it's not a huge group, so I mean, feel free if you'd like to unmute and ask a question to David or Keenan. Please feel free to do so. Just looking at the chat, I do see there was a comment earlier about when there are sometimes new bicycle paths, but cyclists still stick to the road. Not sure if David or Keenan, you have any insights on that, why that might be?
I mean, a lot of times, I think it has to do with the fact that we usually are planning bike lanes on a piecemeal basis, on a site-by-site, street-by-street basis. And there is very rarely a sort of connected grid of bike lanes. So again, I don't know the particular context you're talking about, but oftentimes bike paths, when they're installed, it might be for 500 meters or a kilometer at a time. And someone might be riding for 4 or 5 kilometers. And so they decide, well, there's not really a bike path or bike lane the entire way, so I'm not going to go out of my way to go on it. They might also be going to a destination that's kind of like on the street. It might be a shop or a business on the street. And again, if it's much more convenient for them to be on the road rather than taking a detour to go on the bike path, they might choose to do that. Again, it's one of those things where sometimes people, when they're riding their bikes, don't necessarily make the safest choice. They make the most convenient one. That's something that people do on foot. And it's something people do when they're behind the wheel of a car as well. We kind of all, our human nature is to take the path of least resistance, even if it's not necessarily the smartest or safest thing for us to do. And that's kind of where the idea of building a connected grid of bike lanes, the idea of building Vision Zero infrastructure is so important, because then as human beings, we all make mistakes. We all do not wise things sometimes. And so if we build systems and infrastructure that protects us from ourselves, that's kind of the sort of idea behind building that safe infrastructure.
Great. Yeah, and I think a follow-up comment there that the location was Leslie and Elgin Mills. I assume that's our new part of the Lake to Lake system going from Lake Ontario up to Lake Simcoe. I know that does run along Leslie, and there's a multi-use path there. I'm wondering if perhaps that's just a matter of perhaps cyclists not either knowing it's there or maybe assuming that it's a sidewalk and not to be cycled on. So definitely, I mean, I think there's a way to go in terms of just raising awareness about some of this infrastructure, in addition to adding the infrastructure itself. Let me throw another question in, maybe just for Keenan. There's a question. So the video or a video on bike maintenance, where could that be found online? The one that just happened from Keenan, that video will be on our city YouTube channel. Keenan, I don't know if you wanted to mention a couple other spots people could look for bike maintenance.
On our Markham Cycles website, markhamcycles.ca, we do have recordings on all our past maintenance related webinars. So just check that out. It's on their programs on our Markham Cycles website.
Perfect, thank you.
And I will just pop the link to that into the chat.
Perfect, thanks, David. And oh, there it is. Okay, and I see we're just past 8. Let me just oh, the cats are getting hungry, it sounds like.
Yep. Sorry about that. Yep.
No. Let me just put out one other comment that's come in about protected bike lanes. So it sounds like there are more protected bike lanes in Toronto. Most bike lanes in Richmond Hill are right next to car lanes without, I guess, the actual separation. Any thoughts on that, David or Keenan?
Yeah, I mean, the physical separation is what goes from, is when we talk about creating complete streets that are safe and accessible for people of all ages and abilities, the physical separation is really the key towards creating a street where everyone can feel safe using it, riding their bikes on it, versus when there isn't that physical separation, you get folks who are more comfortable with risk in their lives. And oftentimes that means not older adults or not children, or not people who might be less confident cyclists. So the separation is really, separated bike lanes are really a key ingredient in getting large transportation mode shifts and really creating a place where everyone feels comfortable and considers riding their bikes as a real mode of transportation that they can use to get them to leave the car.
So that would be the aim, or the maybe the best version, if we're gonna, if we could sort of create that hierarchy almost, for bike infrastructure, cycling infrastructure, would be, in your view, be the protected ones. So, and perhaps if they're not protected now, maybe it's a first step towards getting there. But yeah, I think that's a great point to raise. I mean, as in terms of a barrier, is just the safety factor. So yeah, hopefully we will be moving in that direction, in places like Richmond Hill.